In the year 922 AD, a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled through the icy frontiers of Russia and witnessed something so horrifying, so visceral, it would scar his soul forever. He saw the Vikings perform a brutal funeral ritual. A slave girl, drugged, violated, and paraded through a grotesque rite of passage, was then burned alive beside the corpse of her chieftain master. This wasn't fantasy. This wasn't myth. It was a first-hand account, a grim window into a culture that blurred the lines between violence, sex, death, and power. What you're about to uncover is drawn from historical sources, eyewitness testimony, sagas, and archaeological evidence that expose how Viking sexuality wasn't just personal, it was political, it was warfare. It was domination encoded into the very structure of society. They used sexuality as a weapon of psychological destruction, a tool to enforce control, a terrifying measure of masculine status, and even as a ritual bridge to the afterlife. From family-attended wedding consummations to public executions soaked in sexual humiliation, Viking culture was drenched in rituals that modern minds would struggle to comprehend. Sexuality wasn't private. It was a public act, a test, a performance. It determined your rights, your reputation, your worth, and sometimes whether you lived or died. The act itself was dissected and classified by dominance. To penetrate was to rule. To be passive was to fall into social exile. 2 words could destroy you: agri and raga. These weren't mere insults. They were death sentences. They meant unmanly, effeminate, or submissive. And Viking law was crystal clear. If someone accused you of being raga, you had the right to kill them and face no punishment. That's how seriously they guarded masculine status. The passive man, the one perceived to have taken a submissive sexual role, was stripped of his identity, his property, his weapons, even his ability to testify in court. In Viking eyes, being penetrated erased your manhood. You became a ghost in your own society. This created a social hierarchy more brutal than any caste system. Masculinity wasn't just about appearance. It was about aggression, dominance, and unflinching performance. The Icelandic sagas overflow with blood-soaked feuds ignited by sexual slander. The saga of Burnt Njal details how a simple insult, calling a man soft, sparked a chain reaction of violence and death. In the Egil saga, warriors travel miles to avenge sexual insults with cold-blooded murder. These weren't rare exceptions. They were systemic. Even women weaponized this culture. Some sagas describe wives publicly humiliating their husbands by questioning their bedroom performance. In Laxdela saga, one woman ends her marriage and destroys her husband's reputation by accusing him of being too gentle. In Viking society, being too kind was a sin, and sex was a battlefield. Every act, every rumor, every insult had violent consequences. Sexual dominance became a feedback loop of brutality. Men were expected to constantly prove their masculinity through force, through conquest, through public displays of strength, especially sexual strength. But the darkest layer of this system was how they used sexual violence as a psychological weapon, not just against women, but against men. The sagas describe a chilling practice called klumhug, the shame stroke, where victorious warriors would slash or stab the buttocks of their defeated enemies. Symbolic penetration. This wasn't random cruelty. This was calculated humiliation. It turned warriors into victims and marked them permanently as conquered. It wasn't about lust. It was about erasing dignity, and often symbolism wasn't enough. The Vikings took it further, far beyond metaphor. Captured kings and nobles were sometimes publicly raped, a shocking act not of desire, but of ritual emasculation. The saga of the Volsungs details how this was used to transfer masculine energy from the victim to the victor. To be forced into the passive role was to be spiritually dismantled. It was believed that this act literally stole your essence and empowered the aggressor. Viking masculinity was a system of theft, where power was seized, not shared, where humiliation replaced execution, where death could be preferable to defeat. Every part of Viking sexual culture served a purpose: to maintain fear, enforce hierarchy, and institutionalize brutality. These weren't barbaric exceptions. They were the rule, documented, systematic, designed. And perhaps the most disturbing truth: these beliefs didn't vanish. They bled into medieval Christian Europe. They helped shape concepts of male dominance, of honor, of social roles and justice systems that still echo in subtle ways to this day. Viking sexuality wasn't about freedom. It was about control. Control of the body, control of the mind, and control of society itself. It's a past many would rather forget. But history doesn't care if you're uncomfortable. It only demands that we look closely. And remember, a sexually violated man couldn't return to his community with honor intact. His own people would often reject him because he had been marked as unmanly. Some victims committed suicide rather than live with the shame. Others became outcasts, wandering between communities as living reminders of Viking dominance. Vikings practiced sexual enslavement on an industrial scale. The slave markets of Dublin and York were filled with captives destined for intimate use. The sagas matter-of-factly describe how raiders divided human beings like livestock, with the most attractive reserved for leaders' personal collections. The Yokney saga mentions Earl Seeger keeping a harem of captured Irish women, treating them as interchangeable objects for his pleasure. Viking laws created a two-tier system that would make a parade look progressive. Free women had extensive protection against sexual assault, but captives had no rights whatsoever. Any free man could use a slave sexually, and killing a slave for resistance barely qualified as a misdemeanor. The legal code of medieval Iceland states that raping a free woman carried the death penalty, while raping a slave woman resulted in a fine equivalent to damaging someone's property. The scale of this system was staggering. Archaeological evidence from Dublin suggests that up to 30% of the population consisted of slaves, many captured specifically for sexual purposes. The Vikings created an entire economy based on human trafficking for intimate exploitation. This systematic dehumanization served a strategic purpose. Communities that heard about Viking sexual practices often surrendered without fighting rather than risk having their people subjected to such treatment. The mere threat of sexual violence became a weapon of conquest, more effective than any sword. Viking weddings made modern reality TV look tasteful by comparison. Privacy wasn't just uncommon, it was legally problematic and potentially expensive. The bride's family had to witness the couple's first sexual encounter to ensure proper consummation. Without witnesses to confirm that penetration had occurred, the marriage could be declared invalid, and the bride's family could demand the return of the dowie. Imagine having to perform sexually while your in-laws took notes for potential court proceedings. The ceremony itself was loaded with sexual symbolism that would make a porn director blush. The ritual of Mjolnir involved placing Thor's hammer on the bride's lap during the ceremony. Everyone understood this as a fertility blessing with explicit phallic meaning. The hammer was then blessed by the priest and passed around for guests to touch, creating a communal sexual ritual disguised as religious ceremony. The groom's removal of the bride's bridal crown served as a public announcement that he was about to take her virginity. This happened in front of the assembled witnesses, who would then escort the couple to the marriage bed. Priests and family members blessed the bed with fertility prayers that were essentially sanctified dirty talk. The consummation itself took place while family members waited outside the door, listening for sounds that would confirm the marriage's completion. The morning after, bloodied bed sheets were examined and displayed as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's success. These sheets were often preserved as legal documents that could be presented in court if the marriage was ever disputed. In some cases, trusted family members actually remained in the room during consummation to provide eyewitness testimony. In the saga of Greta the Strong, a bride's uncle literally stayed in the room to witness the consummation of the marriage. Imagine your Uncle Mike watching you have sex with your wife. As disturbing as that sounds, it was deadly serious. If the bride wasn't a virgin, her family could be sued for fraud. If the groom failed to perform, they could demand payment for damaged goods. Icelandic law went into graphic detail. Legal codes outlined penalties for sexual failure on the wedding night, turning intimacy into a commercial agreement. It wasn't about love. It was about inheritance, land, and bloodlines. Emotions were irrelevant. The act itself was a transaction, and the consequences were financial, legal, and deeply public. Love was a luxury Viking society didn't have time for. And then there's Ahmed ibn Fadlan's infamous account, a real-time witness to a Viking funeral so disturbing that historians spent centuries trying to disprove it. But archaeology confirmed the worst. He was telling the truth. When a Viking chieftain died, the funeral wasn't a moment of mourning. It was a ritual of sex, sacrifice, and spiritual transfer. For days, the dead man's slave girls were asked, "Which of you will die with him?" One would volunteer, believing she would join her master in the afterlife. What followed was nothing short of ritualized horror. The chosen girl was drugged, intoxicated, and used in repeated sexual encounters by men from the tribe. Each man whispered the same line, "Tell your master, I did this out of love." They believed that by using her body, they were transferring their essence, a kind of spiritual energy, to their fallen leader. Ibn Fadlan describes the process in cold clinical detail. The girl was treated as a sacred vessel, absorbing the life force of the tribe to carry into the next world. On the final day, she was taken to the funeral ship. 6 men, each symbolizing a different power in the tribe, had sex with her one last time. Then came the final ritual. The girl was strangled with a cord, and as she struggled for breath, she was stabbed by an old woman known as the Angel of Death. Her body was laid beside her dead master. The ship was set on fire as the tribe chanted, believing they had fueled his journey to Valhalla with sexual energy and blood. These weren't stories meant to shock. They were real. And modern archaeology has uncovered chilling evidence that Ibn Fadlan's words weren't exaggeration. They were a grim record of a society where sex, death, power, and belief collided in ways still hard to comprehend. In the saga of Greta the Strong, a moment of supposed celebrations turns disturbingly intrusive. The bride's uncle remains in the room to witness the consummation of the marriage. Let that sink in. Imagine your Uncle Mike sitting silently nearby as you're expected to perform one of the most private acts of your life, while he watches to ensure it's done properly. As bizarre as it sounds today, it was deadly serious back then. If the bride wasn't a virgin, her family could be sued for fraud. If the groom failed to perform, they could demand financial compensation for damaged goods. This wasn't about love, attraction, or consent. It was a binding contract, and the body was part of the proof. Icelandic law codes didn't shy away from these matters. They listed specific penalties for failures on the wedding night, including fines, marriage annulments, and legal consequences. The act of sex itself was legally monitored, a transaction that secured dowries, bloodlines, and alliances. Emotions didn't matter. Love was a luxury Viking society didn't have time for. Marriages were contracts. Consummation was evidence. Performance was law. But if that sounds disturbing, it pales in comparison to what Ahmad ibn Fadlan witnessed. In 922 AD, this Muslim diplomat from Baghdad traveled north through what is now Russia and encountered the Rus Vikings. What he saw during the funeral of a chieftain left him horrified for the rest of his life. Historians once dismissed his writings as exaggeration, even slander, but modern archaeology has proven otherwise. He wasn't making it up. He was documenting one of the most extreme death rituals ever recorded. When a Viking leader died, it wasn't simply a funeral. It was a multi-day ritual of sex, sacrifice, intoxication, and spiritual transfer. Slave girls were gathered and asked a single haunting question: which of you will die with him? One would volunteer, not out of coercion, but belief, thinking she would accompany her master to Valhalla, the great hall of the honored dead. What followed was ritualized dehumanization cloaked in religious purpose. For several days, the chosen girl was drugged and intoxicated and offered to men from the tribe in a ceremonial chain of sexual encounters. Each man whispered the same chilling line: "Tell your master I did this out of love." They genuinely believed they were passing their life force, their spiritual essence, through her body to the dead chieftain. She became a vessel, absorbing the tribe's masculine energy to carry into the next world. Ibn Fadlan's account is disturbingly detailed. He doesn't flinch in describing how, on the final day, the girl was led to the funeral ship. There, 6 men, each representing different powers within the tribe, had sex with her one last time, a final charge of spiritual power. Then, the climax of the ritual. The girl was strangled with a cord, and as she gasped for air, an old woman known as the Angel of Death approached and stabbed her in the chest. A simultaneous act of suffocation and stabbing that marked her transition from sacred vessel to sacrificed soul. Her body was placed beside her chieftain, and the ship was set on fire. The tribe chanted as flames consumed the wood, the leader and the girl, believing they had successfully sent their chief to the afterlife with sex, blood, and fire as his escorts. This wasn't myth. This wasn't metaphor. It was ritualized, spiritualized violence, one that bound sex, death, and power into a single ceremony. And archaeology backs it up. Charred remains of women have been found beside male warriors in Viking ships. Trauma signs, ceremonial items, and drugs in their systems match Ibn Fadlan's observations. His writings, once doubted, are now seen as one of the most important anthropological records of Viking belief systems. These weren't horror stories designed to frighten. They were real, and they remind us that even in the most admired warrior cultures, beneath the mythology often lies a system built on control, humiliation, and spiritual terror.